And welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 35 today, and the topic we're going to be talking about is the idea that you think with your brain. I think this is a really interesting one for me because I've never really been able to sit still whilst I've been thinking. If I'm asked to sit still, I kind of stop thinking, and I almost always seem to work things out through physical activity. In fact, moving my hands around right now, and I think this is true for many people, actually, to some degree, and particularly for neurodivergent people. So I'm really, really interested in getting into this. And today's guest is Elizabeth Rose Arifien. She's a creator, dancer, and social entrepreneur. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you very much for coming on. So if you're new to Delightful Dissent, it's a show really about challenging assumptions and the deep kind of hidden assumptions that can often trip us up and cause problems. It came about from my work with people who are taking a fundamentally different approach to big, deep-rooted, tangled, messy problems, either for individuals or groups, organizations or society as a whole. And very often that work comes into conflict with those deep assumptions. It really is, I want to really share what the process is like, share some specific ideas, but ultimately I want to give everyone the ability to challenge the assumptions that are out there in a positive and helpful way, because I want everyone to be able to do this. I also want to really get out there when you're exploring, not quite having all the answers yet, and what it is to kind of explore and think things through rather than just talking about things when you're absolutely sure and it's completely the case. Because so often with these interesting entangled problems and interesting spaces, you just don't have that available. But people don't often share that online very much, particularly in a professional context. So I also want to get that out there. And it's Delightful Dissent because, we're kind of, challenging some ideas and saying, maybe this is wrong, maybe it is. But the point is to do it gently and kindly and have fun whilst we do it. So it's not about proving ourselves right at anyone else's expense. It's about exploring different ways of seeing things and different perspectives that we might usefully be able to take. This show is genuinely live. We can sometimes talk about personal and challenging topics. So if there's anything in that space that may be difficult for you, please be aware. There is also the possibility that we may use strong language. So if that is an issue for you, also please be aware. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is about asking questions. If you're watching live, please do ask questions in the chat and we'll try and answer them all the way through. We should hopefully be able to see them, all technical things working. If you're watching, listening to the recording, then our contact details will be available at the end if you want to follow up or ask any questions of us directly. So you'll be able to do that. So on to today. And when I was first told about Elizabeth's work, I really, really wanted to get her onto the show. It took us a while to get things together in the diary, which is often the case with these things. But I was really, really keen to get her onto the show. And when we did finally speak, I was really struck by how her ability to express herself in her own way, like a really unique, really kind of embodied way of expressing herself whilst giving other people the space and giving me the space to do that myself. And I think the two combined is a really wonderful thing. So and so that's why I really, really wanted to kind of explore this a bit more and get her on the show today. But that's probably enough of me talking. So could I ask you to introduce yourself, your work, and the kind of people you work with, please, Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That's really, really nice. I guess I work. I do work in dance, and I do provide spaces for other people to explore themselves physically, and to untangle what might be inside their bodies. I don't have a formal qualification to say what I'm doing is right and that I'm kind of, ticking all the boxes, but I am trusting my instincts and the paths that are unfolding in front of me, and I'm listening. And what seems to be happening is people are really being impacted by the work that we're offering, especially online and through our live works at Creative Dance London. Using a lot of visualization, imagination, and instinct, as I said. And yeah, I also make films, which are in the same vein of unraveling people's stories that might not get the light of day or get attention. And so bringing them to mainstream culture in whatever capacity I can, so that we can have a conversation about adult dancers, or we can have a conversation about people who are dancing with dyslexia. And, there's something that comes out of that is valuable for our communities.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting particular I'd like to pick up on, based on really the previous episode around coming to drawing as an adult, and the idea that we can come to some creative pursuit as an adult. I think there's some big barriers around that. So I think it's really wonderful to offer that space, particularly for people who perhaps express themselves in unconventional ways anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, you're so right. It is so important that people do have that space, as I think we're all learning, and that doesn't stop. And I think that there's misconception that you reach a certain age and you're supposed to know everything, and you're an adult and you've got it all together. And there's not enough spaces that allow people to not have it all together and to physicalize that and let their bodies talk.
Absolutely. I think that working the process of working it out is often as valuable as the output, if not more so. I think that's often overlooked in this area. So yeah, no, it's a really exciting one to get into. But before we do, I always like to ask my guests to bring a quote along that kind of gives us a bit of an angle, gives us a bit of support in the direction that we're going in. So could you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually comes, well, a friend of mine sent this to me, and he is also neurodivergent and an artist, Steve Chapman. And he sent this to me, and it just really resonated. It says, it's by Isadora Duncan, and it's, if I could say it, I wouldn't have to dance it. And I think that really sums up me. Just me. No, I'm joking. Yeah, I think it's a really great quote by Isadora Duncan.
Yeah, I really love that. I think it very much speaks to me, and then but the working it out as the working out what doesn't have words, what doesn't quite making sense of things. I think there's something huge in the physical making sense of something before it can have words.
Yeah, and yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that's what choreography is for me, is kind of, taking inspiration from wherever it comes from and just letting my body work that out. What does that mean? What does it feel like? How can I, transcend that into something that someone else can understand or take something from? Dance has that power.
I think the other part that resonates for me is the word "have," in that that you need to get this out somehow. I don't know about you, but I really, one of the great frustrations of perhaps expressing things differently to most people around me is that I can't get it out sometimes. It doesn't flow in the same way, and maybe I picked up habits that aren't helpful that prevent me from getting it out in a meaningful way. And that is so frustrating, and the need to express as actually as a part of kind of mental well-being, particularly I think well-being in general is a huge thing, and I really like that it touches on that too.
How have you found ways to express yourself?
It's interesting. I mean, in some ways, the show is a expression of that. I've really tried to move towards, as much as possible, being comfortable doing these different things, and a lot of it is play to start with, and starting small where I think there might be an outcome, because I'm very much like a lot of people with the ADHD neurotype. I've started many hobbies I've started many things. I've studied many different areas.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of different things. The difficulty is that actually you don't tend to reach a threshold of being good for a long time. And actually, usually when I reach that, I'm usually about done with the thing. So it can be a very interesting thing, this exploratory work and what it is to explore an edge. And I think for me, it's been about creating situations where it's safe to do that and fun to do that, and fun to try stuff out. Okay to fail, okay not to enjoy the thing that I thought I was going to after all and change straight away, not making myself see it through to the bitter end. So for me, it's a question very much of how I approach each thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just lost you at the end there. Did your audio change?
Can you hear me still?
I can hear you. Yeah, it just cut out then at the end.
Okay, strange. Yeah.
You're back.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, and how do you find with, I said at the beginning there that I don't have a formal qualification. I mean, I've trained in dance my whole life. So, I've been to stage school, I've got various different badges to certify me as I can dance. Mm. But in terms of the education system and, having to get those approvals with your work, have you kind of found that you've needed them?
It's a really interesting question, and I think one of the things. Well, first of all, I share one of the kind of recurring experiences of my work with people who are kind of exploring new ideas and starting new things. Is largely people fall into one of two categories. They fall into a category of people who have an awful lot of real world experience and who say, well, I can't do it because I don't have the qualifications. The other group are people who have a ton of qualifications who say, I can't do it because I don't have real world experience. And I think it's, for me, it's a really interesting one. And it's about what gets you to where you want to be and what's the most helpful thing. Qualifications can be helpful. I think there is a bad habit, though, of kind of speculatively collecting qualifications that shows up in all sorts of places. And one of those places is the idea that you kind of need a degree to do a job. It's like, if it's specific and you need specific knowledge, that's reasonable. The idea that you just need a degree, that's just lazy job spec, from my perspective. And I think it's related to that. So it's like, what are my needs? What's the best path? Is it to learn the stuff and get a qualification, or is it to go out there and experience it and figure it out? And I think one of the difficulties I find, and a lot of people I speak to find, is not so much that they couldn't get the qualifications if they were interested in them, but that the qualifications don't take them to an interesting place. Because they don't combine things. They don't think about things in quite the way that they think about things. They don't go in a direction that they want to go in. And so that's often the challenge. And I think where there are qualifications, where you can go where you want to go, that someone else has figured out beforehand, brilliant, do that. But only if they take you where you want to go.
Definitely. And I think finding those different approaches to education is just so vital. We're really stuck in a Victorian education system that doesn't fit everyone. It doesn't suit everyone. And I think my experiences with, having to move to think, have, it's not something that is something that I have to do. It's something that I have to do. Sorry, I lost my words there. But yeah, it's something that I have to do, and to get everything out there and to kind of comprehend what's going on. And it's, I think, not having the support and understanding from the education systems does stop a lot of people from going back and getting those qualifications.
I think that's a real
many you have. Like I was, really admiring, the the different qualifications that you've achieved?
Interestingly, the only kind of I got a degree. I dropped out of a degree the first time after 2 years. I had the typical neurodivergent pattern of extreme success and extreme failure in the same course.
Right.
I won a prize from the Royal Society of Chemistry and dropped out in the same year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's really quite typical of it's not being able to play the game really. And I think there's something really interesting in this around, like, what one of the recurring themes of this show is like is what is proxy measures, what a good thing looks like, rather than actually measuring the thing, like being able to really engage with the thing. And a lot of academic, a lot of the study is actually, well, what do we think one of these should look like, and we try and measure that rather than actually what's good, what we want. And it's a really easy thing for all sorts of organizations recruiting to fall into, and for people to fall into, and it's a really big problem. But I got my degree the second time around because I was studying remotely, and I was very free to choose my own mode of study.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't, because what I realized is actually quite a lot of my learning up until that point, I've been kind of pretending to learn in a classroom and then going home and learning myself in a way that worked for me afterwards.
Wow. Same.
And because I studied a kind of course with the Open University, and it was all remote, I didn't have that layer of pretending to unpick and just use my energy. I could just learn straight up, and it was a lot easier.
And what were your mechanisms? I mean, for me, I've got a whole wall of Post-its up here, and I wouldn't know what's going on without them. And Post-its, I don't know if my family are here, but they would laugh because my bedroom at home was basically just a room of Post-its, and that's how I learned. It was the color of the Post-it. It was the color that I would then attach to it. I would felt tip in a certain color, and that was my visual mechanism of learning. And physically, I would have Post-its on Post-its. It would be the answers, and that physical action would then stick in my muscle memory. I go there for geography in my room, and geography is that color, and that's how I learn, in that movement way. But what were your ways, your mechanisms?
Very similar for me. I'm quite auditory verbal, so I can kind of remember that kind of thing. I'm very non-visual in 2D visual, but I'm very but a lot of 3D, which is a hard thing to describe because for most people, I think they kind of run together. But my kinesthetic sense of like where objects are in space without being able to actually visualize them in a meaningful way is quite strong. So I use that a lot with learning.
Can you explain that a bit further?
Yeah. So say, for example, I mean, the best way to understand your kinesthetic sense is if you shut your eyes and you don't have actually like a picture of a space, but you know where stuff is in space. It's that.
Right, okay.
It's that kind of the relative position of things between things in kind of 3D space. Which was always a big advantage in chemistry up to a point, because you just kind of you can do some of that in your head.
Right. You could almost do an experiment in your head.
Yeah, and there are certain things. It's a spatially dependent field, like knowledge. So I found that quite straightforward. But yeah, so I learn by, but I very much have to move stuff around. And I think this really gets to this idea of, you think with your brain and how much of, for me, I realize I'm very much an extroverted processor, in the sense that I really only work things out by talking them through, by mapping them out and kind of diagramming them out with Post-its too, or writing them out or drawing things I tend to draw quite a lot of things on the computer, because one of my other difficulties is I lose bits of paper. So if I need some order, I need a system that orders things for me instead of me having to do that. So I tend to rely on the computer to do that bit, so I can then track it through. which is helpful, which is another way of learning, actually, and how things cluster together, and them playing with those relationships, but it is very much a moving things around and seeing how they change. I think that's a really, like, what is that from that angle? What is that from that angle? And actually doing that. And I suspect a lot of that is actually in the body. I think that really is the idea that we're effectively a brain in a jar doesn't work from my experience, and neither does it work for the available evidence I'm aware of. So.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. It's funny you say about, well, maybe but your kind of perspective on things and how you can see things from a different perspective. I feel that's what you were saying there. I carry that definitely. And I do see that that's a real skill of people who are neurodivergent, is that we can see things from many different perspectives. And I think in film, I found that is a real, it's just a real asset, basically, is being able to, you can kind of see everything, see a dance or see a story, and know where you can put it into different edits. And
I think it's a really interesting thing, because this is, for me, this is the one of the really big challenges to the idea that you think with your brain is for me, we're always processing stuff. Even if you take a really kind of computational idea of a person, where this information processing model, is it the conventional information processing model starts with okay, so there's a computer. It doesn't really talk about how data gets into the computer. And it's a really, really interesting one for me, because there's so many filters beforehand, and how we work through that, and what we attend to, what we experience, how we feel things, the qualitative difference between those things, between individuals, all play out in how we then, even if we had the same kind of processing, which there's no evidence that we all process differently, that different input experience would change how we responded. And I think actually being able to share that frame of reference, essentially that perspective, with people in a meaningful way is a really, really helpful and positive act, because they can then recruit some bits of that themselves, either because it gives them better ways of kind of expressing something that they didn't have a mode of expression of before, because that's one of the reasons I love doing it. When you're suddenly like, oh, that's tapped into something that's never had awareness, never surfaced. That's a wonderful gift. And equally, it gives people the idea of what's outside of their own, what is outside of their day to day, because we all kind of start with that assumption that everyone experiences the world and everything is as we see it. And obviously there's counter evidence, but it's hard to get specifics. And actually, when someone can give you that and you can really inhabit that and enjoy that, that's a really helpful thing too. I think it builds a different kind of empathy.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it before, like, how do you measure that? You said before, like, what is good, and how do we get those specifics to collect that data and kind of drive it forward? Yeah, I mean, how do you measure?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I'd actually like to start with, in terms of maybe to step back and think, well, what how do we evaluate? Measurement is one way of evaluating, and there are other ways as well. But if you have one of these experiences with someone else, what is it that you would go away if you had a great one versus a disappointing one? How would that work for you? What would great look like in this space? What would disappointing look like?
Well, it's a feeling. For me personally, it's a feeling. It's a feeling of feeling light, and lack of tension. Definitely. And something actually we've started doing at Creative Dance London is when people join our sessions, we ask them how they're feeling today. and we kind of rate it from 1 to 10. And then at the end of the session, we ask them again. And so we can see then from the beginning to the end of the session how that hour has impacted their mood. And we've actually seen last month was a 30% increase in mood. So that, that's one way of measuring mood. But then there's bigger questions. How long does that last for? How long does that good feeling last for? And there's so much more that I would love to kind of unpick and kind of understand.
And I think this gets to the really, when we're sensing into things, when you talk about feelings, they're largely embodied. They're primarily, they emerge from sensation in the body. They're not really kind of quantized. They're not neat little bits. They're very much dynamic, and they change. And I think the other difficult thing I struggle with in that space is like, I don't think I've ever felt happy the same way twice.
Oh, that's interesting.
We say happy, but actually if you get into the feeling, it's always slightly different. It's always slightly different in terms of its positive aspect, and it's always slightly different in terms of the kind of emotional chord that's going on, because there's always other things going on as well, that aren't so enjoyable necessarily, but that are there. And so that whole experience, because you can be kind of blandly happy, or you can be very happy and at the same time experiencing something quite profoundly uncomfortable as well. I think they're quite different experiences. So how we capture that and how we evaluate that is a really fascinating one. And I think it's really, perhaps it's a really big challenge to this idea. If we think outside of our brains, how are we evaluating on that basis too? And I don't think there are great tools to do it at all. No. It's absolutely quite a tough thing to do.
Yeah, I think coming from a dance background, I was always, if I was copying the choreographer and I had every move exactly the same and the same as everybody else, thumbs up, that's a perfect performance. But when doing contemporary dance, and especially improvisation, it's really hard to know what's good and what's not, because it's so personal and it's so much about your own experience as opposed to someone else's gratification for what you're doing. And
I think we also have a sensitivity to that. I think this is one of the really interesting things is, yes, I think there's an assumption out there that doing stuff for our own satisfaction is selfish. I'm a big believer in enlightened selfishness anyway. We're differentiated beings. If we don't look after ourselves, if we don't meet our own needs, we put that burden onto others. And so actually there is some, that's not to say selfishness over everything else, but it's about creating a positive intersection between our needs and our experiences and other people. So it's like, I need this, you need that, then, and we can both do that better when we get together and do that. It's creating that. And I think we are actually quite good at innately doing that very often. What's really interesting for me around certainly the idea of the more expressive forms of creativity and dance is their dynamic nature. They're different each time. And they're also different depending on context. They're different who they're with, what space you're in, all of those things. And I think that is also, again, a huge challenge to measuring them, because it's like, what's good for here right now? Because there is a degree of subjectivity to their success. That's really difficult to get a handle on. We just kind of know it when we've experienced it on some level, which doesn't feel like a very good answer.
Yeah. And I guess, then I think about, well, why do I need to measure it? But I think the way that the kind of the world is at the moment is that, we need data, and there's got to be an answer. You start with Y and you get X, and then you did this in the middle, and why did you get those results, and why are they so good? So yeah, I think the way that things are set up is not necessarily supportive of people who are emotional investigators.
Yeah, that role of the role of the intuition in kind of developing questions, rather than the role of the cognition in answering them. Which does feel like, for me, one of the fundamental modes of how our brain works, really. That there's a part of our brain that's like, okay, what's a good thing to try and do? And then there's a part of our brain that's like, okay, how do I do that?
Yeah.
And it makes sense that we have both, because however good you are at executing, on a specific thing, if you don't ask a good question, if you don't have a good objective, if you don't have good strategy, you're not going to get any effect at all. You might be incredibly good at doing, at perfectly executing something that's of no use to anyone whatsoever. And I think that's a really interesting, it's a really, really interesting space, particularly in the current situation, where computers and digital stuff have got really quite good at doing the kind of repetitive, like recreation of things. And maybe 100, 150 years ago, that wasn't available. If you wanted to see a perfect expression of something, you'd have to go there and see the local one. So the value of people being able to reproduce exactly what something else was higher, because if someone completely mangles Beethoven in a kind of you don't know what the original intent was. However, when you can get one of the best, you can get access to the best recordings, the best performances of anything, just at the click of a button, that value is kind of diminished. And the value of something that's much more sensitive to the exact context and is a kind of reinterpretation, I think, is increased. And so for me, I think there's something really, really interesting in that, around how we evaluate a question. Like, what is a good question? And how we evaluate the practices that lead us to ask better questions. Because I think that's often, when we talk about stuff that comes before words, which for me, movement comes before words, and the kind of that processing, it's not necessarily that it gives a rise to an answer. It gives a rise to a question that I can answer when previously I couldn't.
How does that manifest? Like, what is that process?
It's mainly that I basically do what I want.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think it's about kind of creating spaces where it's safe to do that and helpful to do that, and a kind of set of boundaries so it can be playful. And I think this is a really interesting thing, because we often kind of unconsciously create them to stay safe, and that's a good thing. But we can then intentionally work with them, because there's always got to be some rules. Because I think this is a really interesting thing, actually. I'd be interested to think about your dance classes, and you're hosting a lot of people, a lot of different backgrounds. You don't entirely know what's going to happen, but you have a kind of set of an agreement about what's probably going to keep us safe, what's going to be good, so we can go off and explore in another way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, how we set the sessions up is we explain at the beginning of the session that this is your space. Especially online, it's much easier to do that please, this is your space and your time, and if there's anything that we say that doesn't feel right for you, adapt. Make sure that you listen to your bodies and that you're adapting to make sure that you're suiting yourself as opposed to suiting what we're saying. And then we offer exercises. They're not things that people have to do. So, we really enjoy seeing what comes from a simple, we might say, We've on Zoom, we've got, say, 20 people in a session, 20 screens, and we're asking people to respond physically to someone else doing the opposite or something, and that's incredibly open to interpretation. What does that look like? Is that through height? Is that through length? Is that through weight? Is it speed? Is it emotion? So there's a lot of play that can happen with our offerings. And I think that's really important.
I think it's something really interesting for me in what you said there around the importance of creating an invitation and being clear that it is an invitation, not a command, not a requirement, and that invitational space, and also from a kind of structural design point of view, creating something that works with invitations, because it's not necessarily quite the same as working with commands, with instructions. It's actually a slightly different thing. And being clear when you're saying, okay, well, these are the steps you follow to get this specific outcome, versus this is the invitation because we think it's going to be, we think there's value there, is a very different thing. And actually, I think most spaces kind of play between the two. They're like all of one or all of the other. Well, some places are actually all command, all direction, but actually most spaces are effective when they're elements of both. It's basically like, this is the quick way. We know this works. If you want this, then you can do this, and tell us if it doesn't work, kind of thing, for you or for versus the kind of more open invitation. But that, I really like your, how you've phrased that around inviting people into something rather than, and to do it in their own way as well. That's the other thing, is like, there's no specified way of doing this. We're inviting you to do this without saying, this is what you do.
Yeah, and there's at the halfway through the session at the end, if anyone wants to share what came up, there is an opportunity for that, but it's not mandatory. And actually, just hearing you speak then, it's made me reflect on my journey and how I think I was told to do a lot. As we are in education, there's obviously a right and a wrong. There's a lot of rules to follow in school. And then university is the same. You're trained to be a West End performer, and there's a very regimented structure there that you have to follow. And then leaving stage school and then going on to be a performer, there was the director, there was the choreographer, and then you don't have a job. As a performer, you go from having a great job to nothing. And that space of nothing became that space of self-exploration. Why I began to question, why am I doing this? Why do I need these rules? Why do I have to stick to a regimented plan for my body? And I found a lot connected with my self-worth and ego. But just hearing you speak then, actually, I've never, as I said at the beginning, I've really let things unfold naturally and not massively question them too much, because it felt right to, establish the social enterprises. But especially with Creative Dance London, actually, it became my space to understand myself through my body, and without rules. And that's actually been, so important that I then, provided that space to others. But actually, just hearing you speak, then it just clicked in my head, like, wow, it's, all those rules, like, of course I had to find something that would give me some freedom, but still allow my body a chance to talk to me. And improvisation was that space for me.
The experience really resonates, actually. And I think for me, similarly in business, in work, that's been my approach to, to my own work as well, and what didn't work. The other thing that maybe I have found is that where you're doing this kind of, this work that's starts outside of cognition, doesn't have a good explanation yet. and where you kind of just trust in yourself doing that, is very often it can be explained, but just afterwards. It makes sense afterwards. It just doesn't make sense forwards.
True.
And this is really interesting because this relates to complexity and this idea of complex systems being those that you can't calculate forwards, but that you can make sense of backwards. Or certainly it's harder to calculate forwards than it is to just do the thing and see what happens. That's kind of one way to understand it. And that when we're working in this space of these kind of the problems that we've experienced and the really tangled stuff for ourselves and for other people, I think it's to accept that some of the work is going to be like that is really, really quite important, actually. And it's not something that we're very often told is okay.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's like, and it's not something that's developed, and it's not something that's given space for. And I think for me, there's something really interesting in that around creating those spaces, and also bringing that into the wider world, because it's also the case that they're often like these little safe spaces where it's like, okay, I can get perspective, and then I go back to everything and it's normal.
Yeah.
And for me, okay, well, great, but actually, what if we took that bit further? What if we applied the kind of things we're working out when we're moving, when we're dancing, to other domains, to work, to business, to, or whatever it is? What if we move this around and let the two kind of play with each other, as it were? I think that's a very different space, and giving yourself the permission to do a little bit of that is a huge first step. A lot of this is just permission, but that's a hard thing to grant. That's not something you can just do very often, for me anyway, because I've for so long not been told not to.
Yeah. And I mean, so many people are not connected to their bodies. We sit behind, or at least for the last year, I've been sat behind a desk a hell of a lot more than I've ever been used to in my life. And, I have to force myself to connect with my body now, which never used to be a thing. And I can completely now empathize with people who do sit behind a desk all day. They don't know what their legs look like. They don't know what they feel like. They're not having those opportunities to feel their bodies. Never mind understand that your bodies can communicate to you, and if you've got an aching joint, then maybe there's actually something emotional under there that you're ignoring. That's a huge thing that we're uneducated on, but is, there's scientific evidence behind. So I think there's a lot of layering. A hell of a lot of layers.
So I think, first of all, I'd like to take things in a slightly more kind of practical direction, see if we can start to think about how people might start to apply this for themselves and for others. And that might be an interesting starting point, because I think there's something huge in that particular area. But I'd also like to invite anyone watching to ask any questions. If you're watching on YouTube and you leave a comment, we'll be able to see it. So if you do have a specific question, or you'd like to know how to apply some of this, then please do share anything, and we'll try and bring that in. So, but yeah, from my perspective, I think there's something really big in that. We've touched on this, and like this doing the work for myself and with myself, and doing the work with other people. And I've certainly internalized this idea that the two are kind of separate. And I think there's something really interesting in the idea that they're not that separate after all. And I'd be really interested to know how that sits with your work.
So just so I've got that in my head correctly, could you just talk me through that again?
Yeah, sure. So I think, a lot of the helping work, this idea of working with people to help them, is that I'm good and I'm helping you.
Okay.
From a kind of entirely from a position of like having all the answers and being like, okay, I did this and it worked, so you do this, so I'll show you how to do this and it will work. Yeah.
Got you. Yeah.
Whereas for me, it's actually much more about, okay, we both share this problem. I've got this particular set of skills and I've set this up, and maybe we should try this. Definitely.
I think my learning occurred massively when I was invited to manage a group of dancers who were 60 plus, and I began to facilitate and to manage their session. And I was coming away learning so much more than I was. I don't know if, I believe they were getting something from the session as well, but there was so much more learning that was occurring for me than had been previously. And yeah, there is so, I think as well as a freelancer, you're often alone in your work. And when you can learn to share yourself authentically and what you're going through, there are always people popping up and saying, hey, that's me. I get that too, and I feel that too. And a sense of community is so important. You can't do things of value alone, and you can't get a message out there that is of value alone. And I really, really believe that sense of community and finding your tribe is so important, because that's for me, that's how I learn. I learn from people, from watching people, from understanding people, for unpicking their layers. That's my learning. Conventional way of learning. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting one, and I'd like to share some of my own experiences, really similar in terms of, particularly in terms of, one of the big challenges of doing any of this kind of work when you're doing something that isn't conventional is naming it, is describing it in a way that people get. Because you have a sense of it and you can kind of do it, but actually sharing it beyond just the one-to-one conversations is really hard. And for a long time, I spent a lot of time really struggling to describe what I do, and actually realized that because I can describe it one-to-one, is actually I had to start kind of recording some of that and realizing, and then just using that, because without someone there to kind of bounce off, I really struggle to even kind of to put it into words, to do it. That bit of me just needs someone else there. And the more, the people who I'm increasingly, enjoy being around are the people where the words come easily and it comes easily. And I think there's something really interesting there, because we do have a sense, particularly when we are more intuitive and can be sensitive to things, and might be neurodivergent as well, when it's not safe. And actually, I don't speak, and I'm thinking, why didn't I say that? And actually, on reflection, it's like, because that wasn't safe. Right. Actually, there was a bit of my brain telling me it wasn't safe, and actually, if I sit with it, sometimes it's still right. It wasn't the right thing to say, even though I would have liked to express it. And I think there's stuff around, how we can change the physical situation, how we can change the interpersonal situation, and how we can change how we express ourselves, all as different parts of that picture, rather than it being like any one bit of that, because they all kind of play out with each other. But that's I think it's a really interesting thing, and starting with what works, actually, for me. What has been good, what was it about that I think made it good? Can I get some more of that somehow?
Out of interest, and I may be projecting my method or my ways of working, but is there anything in the response of someone when you're telling them what you do, for instance? Is it the response of the other person that then feeds back, oh, that was good? Or is it that you feel it?
I think there's two different things. That's a wonderful question, because there's two different aspects to this. Again, if you're quite sensitive and you learn to, one of the ways you can learn to keep safe is to develop a very high degree of empathy, in the sense that you sense into other people's embodiment. Again, how much do you think with your brain when you're actually figuring out what someone else is thinking by simulating it in your physical body? We entrain, we mirror, and that one of the ways we understand into someone else's way of being is that we're actually holding a similar posture to them, and that's how we understand. And so I think there's a really interesting question there for me, certainly in my historically, and still sometimes, is there are certain people who kind of overwhelm my ability to sense me.
Right.
I'm just sensing them, and then I can get very, very confused.
Yeah.
So I think that ability to know and to disentangle, okay, this is mine, and this is someone else's in the body, is a huge skill, and it takes a lot to do. It's for me, it's the step that people talk about. You read so many kind of books about empathy. They're all pretty bloody useless if you're sensitive already. So I think some of them are actively harmful. Instead, actually, for me, the work is the disentangling. It's like, is this my feeling? Okay, what can I do about it? Is it yours? Okay, can I give it back kindly?
Yeah. Keep that with you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
come back.
yeah. Be nice to that. Yeah, and it's actually, talking of empathy, I'm sure you already know this, but it's scientifically proven that people who are neurodivergent are more empathetic, and that are, we challenged by that. I personally am extremely challenged by that, and yeah, that's really great to hear that you have been able to find a way to disentangle what is mine and what is yours.
Starting to, yeah.
Yeah, I found that incredibly difficult. And since moving from London to Margate and spending a lot more time on my own, I am dealing with emotions that I didn't realize were there, because I was so busy in London thinking from others' perspectives, which has its powers, but I was missing what was there for me. So it's been a real journey this last year of self-discovery, especially around empathy. Yeah, so that's encouraging to hear that it's something that you're navigating and finding a way to dance with.
Yeah.
Excuse the pun.
No, I think it's such a good metaphor for approaching this work. I think one of the ways I like to kind of try and give people some practical grounding is to think about the things we don't have to do as much as the things we do have to do, or we could do as a result of this being different. And I think that idea of having to have a specific outcome to everything, having to, like, when you're drawn towards something, even in a professional context, is like there's that bit of my brain that goes, okay, well, what's that for? Why do I need that? I need that, and there's also the pull in me that's just attracted to it. And also I get this with people. It's just like, I really want to talk to that person. I have no idea why, but I really want to talk to that person. This show is a good example of a vehicle for doing that, by the way, because very often it's like, hopefully it's useful for other people, but hopefully they're intrinsically useful conversations as well. And it's kind of, it's not quite an excuse, but it's also not an excuse. And so being able to, first of all, allow yourself that, and second of all, to kind of create vehicles for it, is a really, for me, a really helpful kind of tips, where you don't have a sense of exactly what it is yet. That's okay. And the dance is such a good metaphor. I often use music because I really struggle with the metaphor of a journey for development, because a journey has an endpoint. And the purpose of a journey is to get there, really. It is implied, and people say it's the journey, not the destination. But no, the journey doesn't exist without the destination. So I struggle with that. For me, the metaphor is playing a piece of music. The purpose of playing a piece of music is not to get to the end. Other than
a piece of music.
Other than what's the piece, the symphony thing that goes really, really fast. Anyway, but generally, it's about the experience itself, and they're both valid. But actually, leaving yourself some space for the music and to dance with the work, whatever your work is, I think is a really, really important stuff. And actually allowing yourself to not do all the time, which is a scary thing, and very often, actually, the dancing yields hugely more effective and valuable things, but you just don't know what they are yet, and you don't know them ahead of time, and that's really difficult. Because then you trade something where you're getting a small return for a big return, for a potential big return. And for me, it's like, okay, we'll start very, very small. just give yourself, if you're entirely in doing, and entirely in your head all the time, give yourself like 5 minutes a day. Go through, like, have a sit and think all of the tasks, and like the lowest value, most draining task, the thing that you really don't like doing and doesn't really get you any return. Try not doing that. Try just doing something with try playing, being, dancing, listening to music, just in that space for 5 minutes a day, and see what happens. And then build from there.
I love that. There's a book I'm reading at the moment, and she says, once a day, find a pleasure pop.
Yeah, that's it.
It explains a pleasure pop as just something that, makes you smile. And that might be even really difficult to find what that is. And for me, I've been really struggling with that. But I think, I'm someone who always is looking around, and I'm always seeing things that, others might miss. And my pleasure pop is just finding a little bit of, joy of something. Like, I have a skylight window in front of me, and just watching the birds sometimes just flying by for a moment, just to catch my breath and then come back to whatever I'm doing. But I think, just finding those things that do make you be. They make you be.
Yeah.
With no destination, like you said.
Yeah, get out of your head occasionally. On that subject, I know there's a number of things you offer, and some things that can probably help people with this if they're inclined to explore. So, is there anything you'd like to share? Any specific offers or anything, or with people, or also how can people get in touch with you in general if they want to kind of carry on and follow up the conversation?
If anyone does want to get in touch, it's my name, which is at the base of the screen, and then info@and.com in between. That's my email. And then in terms of offerings, I would love people to come and challenge themselves, if it feels like a challenge, to reconnect with their bodies through our sessions. So at Creative Dance London, we have lots of different offerings online and live. So the live sessions are in London, in Tottenham. There's 2 a week, and we have 3 sessions as of next week online, and they're all an hour each. And then we have a monthly event where people can experience transformation through creativity in various different ways. So every month we invite a different facilitator teaching a different style of anything really that could have an element of transformation for people. So we've had Qigong, we've had sound healing, we've had art with the body and mind with Steve Chapman, and we had poetry in motion with Ashita Azad. A whole array of different things. So every month it's a bit of a pick and mix, and people can come and experience something new. And then last of all, if physicalizing isn't your thing, but you'd like to listen to something, there's a podcast I do with another social enterprise, Move Beyond Words. And that's speaking to dyslexic creatives who find ways to move beyond words. And we talk about their personal experiences. And we've had some really interesting guests, from Darcy Bussell to AJ and Curtis Pritchard, who are dancers, Adele Tracy, Olympian. There's a whole array of different people from different creative backgrounds that we talk to. And it's been a real learning experience for myself. And I hope that translates to some people as well.
That sounds great. I really enjoy it, and I genuinely intend to come along to some of the online stuff at the very best. I'm not sure I'm close enough to do the in-person stuff at the moment, but yeah. So yeah, I really love the idea of all of that, and do check out the podcast. There's a link to your website actually in the show notes already. If you want to add a couple in anything in the comments, please do. But otherwise, yeah, people can find everything through your website, I guess. Yeah, there or thereabouts. Brilliant. Yeah. Okay, lovely stuff. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Like many of my guests, I would have really liked to carry this on quite a lot longer, but part of my part of my deal with the audience is that I don't go over an hour terribly much. Try and keep it to an hour. It's good practice for me. Because I could go on and talk about stuff for ages. Maybe I should do a long jam session conversation once to see what happens.
People can dip in and out.
Exactly. Until that point, we're just going to kind of bring it to us. So thank you so much for being on the show today. Really enjoyed having you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's honestly been a real pleasure. Yeah.
That's brilliant. And I hope you in the audience enjoyed it too, and that it got you thinking. Do reach out and ask any questions, really. It's about conversation and having this and going on. And do share it with anyone else you think might be interested and kind of talk about it. It doesn't really matter whether you like it or not, in a sense. I'd rather it was talked about than blandly liked. So please do share any questions or if there's any gaps or anything as well with us too. Next episode, I'm going to be talking to Andrew Hugill, composer, musicologist, and creative technologist. And we're going to be talking about the assumption you've got to have a system. I think this is a really interesting one because the expectation that you've kind of organized everything in a specific way and in a certain way and is such a big thing. And it actually ties up really nicely with the conversation we ended up having as well, the questions and the different way of seeing things. And I think when we see things differently, when we do things differently, when we operate outside of the existing system, how do we do that and what does that do? And, the need to systematize everything immediately, I think is a really, really interesting, challenging thing for the way that most people think about particularly work. So, that's going to be same time next week, which is 1 p.m. UK time on Tuesday, the 14th of August. So I really hope to see you all then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent for yourself. Goodbye.